Alright, so this video is going to be on day 3 of creation. Now I'm probably going to split this up into two separate parts, depending on how long it takes me to get through the first part of this, because unlike the first 2 days, which were the topics of the last two videos, day 3 is actually done in two creation speeches instead of one creation speech. Day 3 is the final day of forming the earth, because remember that on day 1, the earth was created formless and void. And so on the 6 creation days, what we see is 3 days of forming and then 3 days of filling, solving the problems of formlessness and void. So on the first day of forming, we saw heaven and earth. We saw two total opposites at the very two opposite ends of the spectrum of creation, I guess you could say. And then on the second day, we see heaven and earth brought together in the firmament. So they're brought a little bit closer together. And now we see at the center of this firmament the creation of the earth. So we see this progressive movement from two opposites closer and closer together towards the center. In the 3 days of filling the cosmos, the next 3 days of creation, 4, 5, and 6, what we will see is the same pattern of this gradual movement towards the center of the cosmos, starting in the heavens with the creation of the celestial bodies. And then on day 5, we have the fish and the birds, which fill the air and the water, which corresponds with the waters above and the waters below. And then at the center of all this, on day 6, we see man created alongside the beasts of the field. Like I said before, day 3 contains two creation speeches, the first of which is the creation of dry land, or the planet Earth, and that's what this video specifically will be about. I might get to the creation of the plants as well, but I think I'll try to keep this video as short as possible, so I might just do a second video on day 3 talking about plants, because that's a pretty big topic in and of itself. Just like on day 3 we see two creation speeches, also on day 6 we see two creation speeches, one for the animals and one for man. Once we get to day 6, I'll talk more about the direct correspondences between animals and earth and man and plants. But for now, just talking about day 3, Genesis 1 verse 10 tells us that God gathered the waters under the sky into one place, and it is in the gathering of the waters that the dry land appeared. God named the dry land Eretz. Remember that Eretz was the name of the material universe as a whole, as per Genesis 1:1. So we can understand that the creation of the dry land is the creation of sort of a blank state which represents all of creation, which exists as a microcosm of the universe, which, just like the formless and void earth of Genesis 1:1, will be filled and formed by God later on, as we'll see in a few videos from now. We can think about the earth as a microcosm, like I just said. We can think about it as the heart of the cosmos, the organ from which life flows out into the universe. Think about this in the context of the structure of a mountain. Mountains are natural temples. The Garden of Eden was a mountain. We know this from Ezekiel 28. And we know from Genesis 2 that it is from the top of the Garden of Eden that life flowed out into the nations, out into the world. Mountains have this symbolism built into their very structure. They have this point at the top, which is fine and selected, a whittled down point, and then going down from this point at the top, the mountain spreads out and stretches down into the ground. So we can think about the earth as the top of a mountain, the point of identity to which the base of the mountain points up, and from which the grace of God flows down into the universe. So there's this twofold relationship of descending and ascending, which is something that we talked about last video as well. So the creation of the earth is the creation of a temple out of the earth by bringing heaven and earth together in a particular way, out of which God's presence will flow out and transform all of creation into a temple. Think about how on day 1, we see God extend his intertrinitarian love out into the divine council. And then on day 2, through the divine council, God brings the earth up into this intertrinitarian love by entering into the waters below and raising them up into the waters above in his glory cloud. Now on day 3, what we see is This communion between heaven and earth, this descending and ascending, being established within the particular context of happening through the earth. The grace of God will unite heaven and earth by flowing out from the waters above, which is carried by the heavenly host, energized by the Holy Spirit. And this water will flow down from the center of creation, from the dry Eretz, down into the sea. And then the sea will be brought back in the water, which flows up into Mount Zion, as we see in Isaiah 66, bringing the nations and their Eucharistic gifts for God with them. We can think about the dry land as the waters below, taken and made solid, given defining identity which solidifies it from its variable, chaotic state which it was in before in the waters below. The solidification of the waters below in the dry earth is the taking of heaven and of heavenly identity and bringing it down into the spiritless or formless matter of the primordial ocean of earth. God takes the waters below and he gathers them, and the dry land appears. God gives the waters below identity from above, and the waters below solidify and point up towards the source of their identity. When you mature, your identity becomes less and less variable and more solidified. It's a lot harder to change an old person's mind about something as opposed to a kid. When you're a baby, there's not a whole lot of defining features about you. You can take your life in a whole lot of different directions, and the difference between you and every other baby is not that noticeable. But as you age and as you grow, your identity becomes more and more fixed. And if your identity has its source in the highest good, which is who is God, then your identity will become increasingly more and more participative in that good, and you will also become more and more unique, more and more solidified in the particular identity through which you participate in the highest good. We can think about the dry land as the stone altar upon which creation is gathered up and offered up to God for him to come down and transfigure and then fill the rest of creation through. The creation of the dry land, or the creation of the earth, as in the planet Earth, sets up a threefold hierarchy of waters below, the earth, and then heaven. There's also a fourfold way that we can think about this. We can think about it as the waters below, then the earth, then the celestial heaven, and then the heaven of heavens. These hierarchies permeate so much of biblical symbolism, and we see this hierarchy directly spelled out in places like Nehemiah 9:6, Revelation 10:6, Exodus 20:11, and many other places as well. We know that later on day 6, God establishes the Garden of Eden at the center of the world, and it is from the Garden of Eden that the world is watered. The water flowing out from Eden is a symbol of God's grace flowing out into the cosmos, from this selected point of identity down out into the world, and then when it's out in the world, it gathers the world and brings it back up to the mountain of Eden to be offered up to God. This is why in Genesis 2, when we hear about the water which flows out from Eden into these different places, we hear about the resources which these other places contain, because man was meant to go follow the streams down into the world, into the earth, and gather these resources and transform them and bring them back up to the mountain of Eden to offer them up to God. And then in offering this up to God, God comes down, transfigures it, and then using the transfigured creation, man goes out and continues to transfigure the rest of creation. This Eucharistic task of gathering creation, offering it up to God for God to transfigure, and then taking what God gives us and using that to transfigure the rest of creation is a pattern that we see permeating all of Scripture. And it's ultimately the entire task of man. And this is why we can understand science as a biblical and Christian task. Man was meant to go out and transform the world. Man was meant to go out and create technology and learn about creation and understand how things are wired and understand how all of these things point up towards God and how we're supposed to take creation and transform it in a way in which God can come down and inhabit creation. We're meant to go out, transform creation into a home for God to come down and transfigure, and then out of that home, which we have created for God, God will work with us to go out into the rest of creation and transform that as well. The task of man is the task of going out into the wilderness and creating a home for not just for himself, but for God. And it is in creating a home for God that we ourselves get our home. We see this in the life of Abraham. Abraham was promised an inheritance insofar as he pitched his tent next to God's altar. Whenever Abraham pitches his tent next to God's altar, that's when we see Abraham blessed by God. In the creation of the world, we see God creating a home for us, and then in response to that, in a dialogical, Eucharistic response to that, we're meant to take the home that God gives us and transform it into a home for God. And in transforming the home that God gave to us into a home for God, God continually gives us a greater and greater home. This is the whole idea of dialogue and the Eucharistic transformation of the world, which I'll talk more about in detail on day 6, my video on day 6. But for now, just kind of have that idea in your mind, because ultimately this pattern of descent, of procession of love and reciprocation of that love, which I talked about in the past 2 videos very extensively, this is the entire pattern of all of Scripture. This is what it's all about. So keep these ideas in your mind as we continue to go through the book of Genesis, and you'll see how this all cohesively fits together. Okay, so anyways, the Garden of Eden at the center of creation, just like Earth is at the center of creation, and then at the center of this center we see man. So when man sins, man being the ultimate microcosm of all creation, the person in which all of creation is gathered up, when man sins, he corrupts this hierarchy, and the waters below lose contact with the waters above, which flow down from Eden. And this is why the waters below are often used as a symbol of creation detached from the communion of God. But the waters below don't become this symbol of detachment until after man sins, because we have to think about the fact that the waters below were used to water the earth originally before man sinned, but it is only after man sins that the waters below become this symbol of detachment and this symbol of we see the deep used as a symbol of hell. The river which flows out from Eden is not just the flow of God's presence out into the world, but it's also the flowing up of creation up towards God. I remember last video I talked about the symbol of wells as the very structure by which we are to understand the communion between heaven and earth. God descends in his glory cloud into the waters below, and then he raises the waters up, and then using these exalted waters, he then rains down his presence on creation, and then this holy water, this holy river then flows out into creation, gathers the waters below, brings them up again, and this process continues. This is, again, the Eucharistic dialogue which structures all of creation. This is the whole purpose of creation, is this Eucharistic dialogue. The Old Testament is set almost exclusively on land. We see that bread becomes a symbol of Jews and fish become symbols of the nations. When we hear about fish, or a particular note is made of the sea in the Old Testament, it is exclusively, almost exclusively in the context of Gentiles. Think about how Jonah went to Nineveh by sea. He could have gone there just as easily, if not easier, by land, but God specifically chose for the events that happen in the book of Jonah to happen in that particular way, to draw this association between the ocean, between the sea, the fish, and Nineveh, and the Gentiles. The 4 Gentile beasts in Daniel come out of the sea. And we see the same connection between the sea and the Gentiles in the prophecy against the ships of Tyre in Ezekiel 27. This is why God promises Abraham and the other patriarchs, and then Israel as a whole, that the nations that bless them will be blessed, and the nations that curse them will be cursed. The Gentile waters below have their identity insofar as they participate in the mode by which God has established the glorification of the world. And this is not to say that Israel is better than all the other nations, because they're the selected mountain, they're the selected altar upon which creation is to be gathered and offered up to God. Rather, it's just that they, in fact, I think all that it means is that they have more responsibility to act in righteousness and act as light bearers for the rest of creation. And ultimately, this is the light that we see Israel painted in the prophetic books, and particularly in the New Testament. In Romans particularly, I'm thinking that Israel was entrusted with the Torah. And when we hear the word entrusted, we're meant to think about it as entrusting Israel with the Torah to fulfill a particular cause. God did not entrust Israel with the Torah for the sake of them having the Torah. God entrusted them with the Torah for the sake of them taking that and bearing that light to the rest of the world. So we shouldn't ever think that God was specifically choosing Israel because he hated all the other nations. Rather, he was choosing Israel because the way that all of reality works is in this hierarchical mode of selection. Think about how, again, the mountains have the selected top, and then it's from this small little point at the top of the mountain that the source of identity for the whole mountain, the source of identity to which the whole mountain points up, comes down from. So it's not that God was choosing Israel because Israel is better than everybody else. Rather, it's just that the whole way that reality works is hierarchical, and there had to be this whittled down selected point from which identity flows out. And ultimately, when Israel failed at their task of being faithful, God himself had to come down and be faithful for all of man. Because Israel failed to bring the nations up into God, or up into relationship with God, God had to come down and bring the nations into relationship with himself by his own arm. And this is why the entire dynamic between Israel and the nations changes in the Gospels. Unlike the Old Testament, which is set almost exclusively on the land, we see in the Gospels Jesus spending a lot of time around the Sea of Galilee with his fishermen apostles, performing fish-related miracles, reaching out to the Gentiles, and performing the sign of Jonah. Revelation also consistently uses this imagery of the land and sea for Jew and Gentile. And again, bringing this back to something that we talked about at the end of last video, when we hear in Revelation 21 that there will be no more sea in the eschatological 8th day of creation, when heaven and earth are united, we can understand that to mean that there will be no more waters below. There will be no more variable waters which need to be reached in this Eucharistic task of man. Everything will be brought into this relationship with God perfectly. And that's ultimately what the task of Jesus was. He was accomplishing the task which Israel was meant to accomplish, and he was taking down the wall of partition between Jew and Gentile, and he was uniting all things in himself so that all things may be united in equality up to the Father. And before I finish this video off, I just want to talk about how we can understand the structure of the earth itself as a microcosmic representation of the structure of the universe as a whole. Remember how we have the threefold hierarchy of heaven of heavens, heaven, or the fourfold hierarchy of heaven, earth, waters below, and we have the waters above between the heavens and the heaven of heavens. And so we can understand the atmosphere of the earth as this waters above, which separate the earth from the celestial heaven, separates the first heaven, which is the air, everything below the atmosphere, from the second heaven, the celestial heaven, everything above the atmosphere. And just as the firmament exists as a heaven under the third heaven, so the earth has a heaven which exists underneath the celestial heaven, the second heaven. And the earth's heaven is the first heaven, the air, which I talk about a bit more on my video on space travel, so check that out if this isn't making any sense to you. The sublunar or subatmospheric realm is the first heaven, which exists between the atmosphere, the waters above, and the waters below, which is the oceans, the sea. And then in between this first heaven and the waters below, we see the earth, the dry land. And so we can see that the earth itself, as a microcosm, as the heart of the entire cosmos, still has this three or fourfold hierarchy embedded into its very structure. All right, so I think I'll end the video here. 20 minutes seems like a solid time to end. I don't want to get into the topic of plants right now because plants is much more extensive than the topic of the earth, or there's a lot more to say about it, or I have a lot more to say about it at least, and I don't want to do another hour plus long video. So I'll keep this one short. I'll end it here. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment down below letting me know your thoughts on this topic. Let me know what you want to hear more of in the future. Pray for me, and God bless you.